Before we dive in, viewer discretion is advised. This content is for what happens when the immovable object of empirical truth collides with the unstoppable force of performative outrage. What happens when a 93-year-old intellectual titan, a man born into the crushing poverty of the segregated South, forged in the fires of the Marine Corps and sharpened in the hallowed halls of the Hoover Institution, walks into a trap designed to humiliate him, only to dismantle the entire mechanism with a few softly spoken sentences. We are told that daytime television is a realm of fluff. We are told it is a landscape of coordinated smiles, softball questions, and promotional banner. But history is rarely made in the places we expect. Sometimes the most brutal ideological battles of our time are not fought on the Senate floor or in the lecture halls of Ivy League universities. Sometimes they happen under the hot, unforgiving studio lights of ABC, between a commercial for detergent and a segment on celebrity gossip. What you are about to witness in this narrative is not a debate. To call it a debate would imply equality of footing. This was an execution. This was the moment Thomas Sowell, arguably the greatest living economist of the last century, walked onto the set of Times, the View Times, and systematically peeled back the layers of hypocrisy that define the modern media elite. It was the day Whoopi Goldberg, the undisputed queen of daytime talk, realized too late that she had brought a script to a gunfight. She expected a frail old man she could lecture on morality. Instead, she found herself staring into the abyss of absolute unyielding reality. This is the story of the interview they tried to scrub from the archives. This is the moment the working class found its voice, not in a shout, but in the terrifyingly calm whisper of a man who had seen too much to be intimidated by a television host. The Tuesday morning at the ABC studios on the Upper West Side of Manhattan began with a deceptive, almost surgical calm. Behind the scenes, the machinery of the show was humming with its usual frantic efficiency. Production assistants with headsets clamped over their ears sprinted down corridors, clutching clipboards. Makeup artists performed last-minute miracles with powder brushes, and the studio audience was being whipped into a frenzy of artificial enthusiasm by a warm-up comic. The air smelled of hairspray and high-voltage ozone. But when Thomas Sowell arrived at the backstage entrance, the atmosphere seemed to shift. He did not arrive with an entourage. There were no publicists fluttering around him, no demands for specific bottled water or lighting adjustments. He arrived alone, walking with the aid of a cane, his movements slow but deliberate. He wore a tweed jacket that seemed to belong to a different era, a sensible tie, and an expression profound, observant stillness. He moved through the chaos of the backstage area, like a ghost from a time when dignity still mattered. When a young runner tried to hurry him toward the green room, Sowell simply paused, looked the young man in the eye, and continued at his own pace. He was 93 years old. He had survived the Jim Crow South. He had survived the Korean War. He was not going to be rushed by a 22-year-old intern with a stopwatch. Inside the studio, the stage was set. Whoopi Goldberg sat at the center of the famous curved table, exuding the casual, almost bored authority of a monarch holding court. To her left sat Joy Behar, practically vibrating with energy, reviewing her cards like a prosecutor preparing an indictment. Sunny host adjusted her glasses, pen poised over her notepad, ready to dissect every syllable. 5 minutes to air, a stage manager shouted, his voice cracking with urgency. Whoopi leaned over to Joy, whispering something behind her hand. They both chuckled. It was a sound that lacked warmth, a sharp conspiratorial laugh. They knew the plan. They had the talking points. This segment was supposed to be a teaching moment. They were going to bring on this conservative icon, this relic of the past, and gently but firmly educate him on the realities of modern America. They were going to show the world that his ideas were outdated, dangerous, and cruel. They had no idea that they were the ones about to be schooled. And we are live in 3, 2, 1. The red tally light on camera, one blazed to life. The audience applause sign flashed and the room erupted in beautiful cheering. Whoopi smiled, that familiar wide grin that had charmed millions for decades. "Welcome back, everyone," Whoopi announced, her voice booming with practiced warmth. Today we have a very special guest, a legendary economist, a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution, and the author of a new book that is stirring up quite the conversation. Please welcome Dr. Thomas Sowell. So walked out. The applause was polite, respectful, but noticeably restrained compared to the raucous welcome, usually reserved for pop stars or reality TV celebrities. He took his seat at the end of the table, placing his cane on the floor and folding his hands on the glass surface. "It is good to be here," so said. His voice was a shock to the system. In a world of shouting pundits and high-pitched excitement, Sowell spoke in a baritone rumble that was barely above a whisper. It forced the entire room to lean in. It sucked the oxygen out of the studio. "We are glad you could make the trip," Thomas Joy said, smiling tightly. "You know, at your age, most people are relaxing on a beach somewhere. But you just keep writing. The problems of the world do not retire joy," so replied, a faint, dry smile touching the corners of his mouth. "So neither can the analysis of them." The audience chuckled. It was a charming opening. For the first 7 minutes, the interview followed the script perfectly. It was the calm before the storm. They discussed inflation rates, the housing market, and historical trends. It was dry, academic, and safe. Sowell was polite, answering questions with brevity and grace. But those who knew the show, the veteran cameramen and producers in the control booth, noticed something unsettling. Whoopi Goldberg was unusually quiet. She wasn't interrupting. She wasn't cracking jokes. She was watching Sowell with the intensity of a predator studying prey. Her eyes were narrowed, tracking his every movement, waiting for him to get comfortable, waiting for him to lower his guard. She was letting the old man talk. She was letting him feel safe. It was a classic ambush tactic. Lull the target into a false sense of security, let them ramble, and then when they least expect it, strike with a gotcha question that destroys their credibility. But Thomas Sowell does not have a guard to lower. He has a fortress of intellect built brick by brick over 9 decades of hard reality. And he saw the trap coming from a mile away. The shift happened at the 8-minute mark. You could physically feel the temperature in the studio drop. Sowell had just finished a point about the dignity of labor and the resilience of the American small business owner. "That is a very nice sentiment, Thomas," Whoopi said. Her voice had changed. The warmth was gone, replaced by a cold, patronizing edge. She leaned forward, crossing her arms on the table. "It sounds very romantic. The struggling shop owner, the bootstrapper. It's a great story for a book." She paused for effect. The audience quieted down. The air crackled with sudden tension. "But let's talk about the real world," Whoopi continued, her voice rising slightly. "You talk about dignity and hard work, as if those are the only things that matter. But aren't you ignoring the reality that for millions of people in this country, people who look like you and me, the game is rigged. The system is designed to crush them?" Sowell didn't blink. He didn't recoil. He simply turned his head slowly to face her. His expression remained totally impassive, but his eyes sharpened into flint. "The system?" Sowell asked. 2 words, flat and neutral. "Yes, the system," Whoopi exclaimed, gesturing broadly to the audience, inviting them to join her outrage. "You sit here and tell people to pull themselves up by their bootstraps. But some people don't have boots, Thomas. Isn't it a bit privileged for you to sit here and lecture the working class on responsibility when the deck is stacked against them from the moment they are born?" There was a collective intake of breath in the studio. This was the attack. She was framing him as a traitor, the Uncle Tom, the elitist who had forgotten where he came from. It was a personal, visceral insult wrapped in the language of social justice. Joy Behar nodded vigorously beside her. "She's right, Thomas. The inequality metrics are staggering." So took a breath. It was a slow, deep inhalation. A lesser man would have stuttered. A defensive man would have raised his voice to defend his character. Sowell didn't either. He simply waited for the echo of Whoopi Unk's accusation to die down, letting the silence hang heavy in the air. "I am not ignoring anything, Whoopi," Sowell said. His voice was still quiet, but now it had a texture like grinding stones. "I am simply refusing to insult the intelligence of the people you claim to protect." Whoopi blinked, clearly taken aback. "Insult them? I'm fighting for them. I'm saying they are victims of a predatory capitalist machine." "How is that an insult?" "Because Sowell said," and he leaned forward just an inch, "when you tell a man that he is a victim, you are not helping him. You are paralyzing him. You are telling the plumber, the truck driver, the single mother working 2 shifts that their efforts are meaningless because the system is too strong for them to overcome. They times are times victims. Joy interjected, sensing that Whoopi had lost a step. Thomas, look at the history. Look at the systemic barriers. I have looked at the history. Joy, Sowell replied, cutting her off without even looking at her. His gaze remained locked on Whoopi. I have lived the history. I grew up in a house with no electricity and no hot water. I have seen poverty that would make the modern definition of struggle look like luxury. And what history tells me is that when you strip a man of his agency, when you tell him that his destiny is determined by forces outside of his control, you kill his spirit long before the economy ever touches his bank account. Whoopi let out a harsh, incredulous laugh. It sounded hollow in the quiet studio. Oh, please. That is just talking points. That is right-wing fantasy. You've been in the ivory tower too long. Thomas, you've forgotten what it's like to actually be poor in America. The producers in the control booth froze. The director's hand hovered over a button to cut to a wide shot. Whoopi had just crossed a line. She had questioned the lived experience of a man who had clawed his way up from the bottom of society. Sowell's face didn't change, but a muscle in his jaw tightened. I have forgotten. Sowell repeated. The question hung there, dangerous and heavy. Yes. Whoopi doubled down, emboldened by the scattered applause from a few confused audience members. You've forgotten. You sit here in your tenure and your awards, and you preach to people who can't put food on the table. You don't understand the modern working class. They aren't lazy, Thomas. They're oppressed, and quite frankly, they aren't equipped to navigate the complex tax codes and legal loopholes that people like you use. They need us. They need the government to save them, because they can't do it themselves. The silence that followed was deafening. They aren't equipped. Asterisk, asterisk. They need us. Asterisk. It was a fatal slip. The mask had slipped. In her attempt to be the savior, Whoopi had revealed the deep rotting core of her philosophy, condescension. So looked at her. He adjusted his glasses with slow, deliberate movement. When he spoke next, his voice was no longer conversational. It was the voice of a judge delivering a sentence. Who is us, Whoopi? Excuse me? Whoopi asked, faltering. You said they need us. You said they aren't equipped. Who is this? Us you are referring to the advocates, the people who care. Whoopi stammered, realizing she had walked into a corner. You mean the wealthy? Sowell corrected, his words hitting like jabs. You mean the Hollywood elite? You mean the people who make $10 million a year to sit on television and tell the man fixing your studio lights that he is too stupid to manage his own life? I did not say stupid. Whoopi shouted, her face flushing red. You said they weren't equipped. So shot back, his volume rising for the first time. A sudden crack of thunder that made Sunny host flinch. You implied that without your benevolence, without your guidance, they are lost children. Do you know how arrogant that sounds? Do you realize the level of contempt that is dripping from that statement? I am an advocate. Whoopi slammed her hand on the table, the sound echoing like a gunshot. I am standing up for the little guy against people like you who want to leave them to starve. You are standing times on times a little guy to make yourself look taller, Saul countered. The retort was so fast, so sharp, it was as if it slapped her. Joy Behar tried to jump in again, her voice shrill. Now, wait a minute. You can't just come in here, and I am speaking to Whoopi. Sowell commanded. He didn't shout, but the authority in his voice was absolute. He held up a single finger in Joy Behar, known for never letting a guest finish a sentence. Close her mouth. She sank back into her chair, silenced by the sheer force of his presence. Sowell turned back to Whoopi. The studio camera zoomed in. The tension was palpable. It felt like the air inside the room was vibrating. You want to talk about the working class? Sowell asked, his eyes boring into hers. Let's talk about them because I don't think you know them. The real working class is not looking for a handout. They are looking for the government to get its boot off their neck. They are looking for schools that teach their children to read and write instead of teaching them to be political activists. They are looking for safe streets so they can walk home from their second job without being mugged. And who opposes those things? Whoopi? Who fights against school choice? Who calls for defunding the police? Who creates the inflation that destroys their savings? He leaned in closer. It is not the working class. It is the U.S. you are so proud of. That is a lie. Whoopi screamed. She was losing control. Her composure was fracturing in real time. She looked around the table for support, but Sonny and Sarah were looking down at their desks, terrified of being caught in the crossfire. We are the party of the people. We are the ones who care. You are the party of the faculty lounge. So said, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm register again. You are the party of the penthouse. You sit here in New York City in a studio that burns more electricity in an hour than a small town uses in a week. And you lecture the coal miner in West Virginia about his carbon footprint. You lecture the mother in Chicago about why she shouldn't have a gun to protect her family, because times of armed security waiting for you backstage. A murmur rippled through the audience. It started low, but it was growing. It wasn't booing. It was a sound of agreement. It was the sound of people realizing that the emperor had no clothes. You despise the working class, Whoopi, Sowell said, delivering the words with the precision of a surgeon. You despise their values. You despise their faith. You despise their independence. You only love them when they are dependent on you. You only love them when they are on their knees asking for help. Whoopi was sputtering, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. How dare you? You don't know me. You don't know my heart. I don't need to know your heart. Sowell said, I only need to listen to your words. The producers were shouting in the headsets now. Asterisk, go to break. Go to break, asterisk. But the director didn't switch. He couldn't. This was the most compelling television that had aired in a decade. It was a car crash and Thomas Sowell was driving the bulldozer. The battle had been joined. The trap had been sprung. But the predator was now the prey. And as Thomas Sowell adjusted his cufflinks, preparing for the final blow, everyone in that room knew that the worst was yet to come. The air in the studio had become thin, brittle, as if a single wrong word might shatter the glass table into dust. Whoopi Goldberg was no longer sitting back in her chair with the relaxed posture of a host in control. She was leaning over the table, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge, her breathing audible through the lapel microphone. She had tried to corner Thomas Sowell with the weaponized empathy that had worked on so many other guests. She had tried to shame him, but shame only works on those who are unsure of their own morality. And Thomas Sowell had not been unsure of anything since 1953. You don't know my heart, Whoopi had said, her voice trembling with a mix of rage and disbelief. I don't need to know your heart, Sowell repeated, his voice dropping to a register that felt like gravel grinding under heavy tires. I look at the wreckage of your policies. I look at the destroyed families, the crime-ridden neighborhoods, the schools where graduation rates are higher than literacy rates. You judge yourself by your intentions. Whoopi, I judge you by your results, and your results are catastrophic. Joy Behar, unable to tolerate the sight of her co-host being dismantled, finally snapped. She lunged forward, her index finger stabbing the air. This is exactly what I'm talking about. Joy shrilled, her voice piercing the heavy atmosphere. You sit there with your cold statistics and your results, but you don't care about the people. It's cruel, Thomas. It is cruel to tell people they're on their own. It is cruel to cut the safety net. You act like you've turned your back on your own community just to get applause from the right. The accusation hung there naked and ugly. It was the Uncle Tom slur dressed up in the polite language of daytime television. The audience gasped. Even for Times of View asterisk, this was a step too far. So turned his head slowly toward Joy. He didn't look angry. He looked at her with the weary patience of a professor dealing with a particularly slow student who had not done the reading. Cruel? So asked softly. Yes, cruel, Joy insisted, though she shrank back slightly under his gaze. Let me tell you what is cruel. Joy, so said. He began to tap his finger on the table, a rhythmic, hypnotic beat. Cruelty is lying to people. Cruelty is looking a young man in the eye, a young man full of potential, and telling him that his skin color is a prison. Cruelty is telling him that he cannot succeed because of history, so he shouldn't even try. Cruelty is lowering the standards of education because you don't think those people are capable of excellence. He paused, and the silence that rushed in to fill the gap was heavy enough to crush a lung. I have spent my life trying to get the government out of the way so that black families can rise. So continued, his voice gaining power, vibrating through the studio floor. You have spent your career advocating for policies that keep them dependent on the state for their housing, their food, and their health care. You want them to be pets, joy, well-fed, well-kept, and on a leash held by people like you. I want them to be free men and women. Now you tell me which one of us is cruel. Joy opened her mouth, but nothing came out. She looked at Whoopi, desperate for a lifeline. But Whoopi was already launching the counterattack. We give them safety, Whoopi shouted, abandoning all pretense of a civilized interview. She was standing now, or half standing, hovering over her chair. We give them a floor to stand on. Without us, they would have nothing. We provide the safety net that keeps this country from collapsing into anarchy. This was the moment. The escalation was over. The explosion had arrived. Thomas Sowell stopped tapping his finger. He placed both hands flat on the table. He pushed his chair back. The sound of the metal legs scraping against the floor echoed like a shriek in the quiet studio. Slowly, painfully, but with immense dignity, the 93-year-old man stood up. He did not look frail anymore. He looked like a monument carved from granite. He towered over the seated hosts. He leaned forward, intruding into their space, dominating the visual field of every camera in the room. You call it a safety net. Sowell boomed. His voice was no longer a whisper. It was a command. It filled the rafters. It shook the lighting rigs. I call it a spider's web. You are twisting everything. Whoopi cried, but her voice sounded then greedy, like a child arguing with a parent. I am clarifying everything. Sowell roared back. You claim you provide a floor to stand on. No, you build a ceiling that they cannot rise above. You create a world where a single mother cannot survive without the state. And then you call it compassion when you sign the check. You destroy the fatherhood in the home with your welfare incentives. You destroy the safety of the street with your soft on crime ideology. And when the community burns, you arrive with a camera crew and a promise to throw more money at the fire you started. We are trying to help, Whoopi screamed, tears of frustration actually springing to her eyes. She was losing and she knew it. She was being stripped naked on national television. Help! Sowell's laugh was a dark, dangerous sound. If you wanted to help, you would get out of the way. But you don't want to help. You want to control. That is the dirty little secret of the American left. Whoopi, you need the poor. You need them to be poor. You need them to be angry. And you need them to be afraid. Because if they were prosperous, if they were independent, if they were strong, they wouldn't need times. You asterisk. The camera operators were frozen. The producers were screaming into the headsets. Cut the mic, cut the mic. But the audio engineer sat with his hands in his lap, mesmerized. He couldn't do it. No one could do it. It was like watching a natural disaster. You don't intervene. You just witness. Sowell raised a hand, pointing a trembling finger directly at Whoopi's face. You speak of the working class as if they're a charity case. Sowell said, his voice dropping to a deadly rhythmic cadence again. You pet them. You feed them scraps from your table. And when they bite you, when they vote for the wrong person, when they pray to the wrong God, you threaten to put them down. You call them deplorables. You mock them. You despise them. I have never you despise them every day. So we'll cut her off. Relentless, a battering ram of truth. You despise their freedom. Because a free man does not need a talk show host to tell him how to live. A free man does not need a bureaucrat to tell him how to raise his children. He leaned in so close that Whoopi recoiled physically, pressing her back against her chair. You are not the savior of the poor. Whoopi Goldberg. Sowell delivered the verdict. Each word a hammer blow. You are the architect of their despair. You have built a plantation of good intentions, and you are angry that the workers are finally hopping the fence. The silence that followed was absolute. It was total. It was a kind of silence that usually only follows a gunshot. The audience sat paralyzed. There was no applause. There were no boos. There was only the shock of hearing the unspoken truth articulated with such devastating clarity. Whoopi Goldberg sat with her mouth slightly open. Her glasses had slid down her nose. She looked small. She looked defeated. For the first time in her career, she had absolutely nothing to say. Thomas Sowell stood there for a moment, letting the words settle, letting the weight of them crush the remaining ego in the room. He looked at Joy, who was staring at her desk. He looked at Sonny, who was refusing to make eye contact. He took a slow, deep breath. He adjusted his tie. The fire in his eyes dimmed, replaced by a cold, final resolve. "I came here today," So said, his voice returning to that soft, gentlemanly whisper, hoping to have a conversation about economics. "But I see now that is impossible. You do not want a conversation. You want submission? You want me to validate your delusions?" He reached up to his lapel, his hand wrapped around the small black microphone clipped to his jacket. "I have not submitted to better people than you," Sowell said, "and I will not start today." With a swift, decisive motion, he unclipped the mic asterisk, thwack asterisk. He placed it on the glass table. It sat there between them, a black plastic object that looked like a weapon surrendered after a war. So turned away from the hosts. He looked directly into camera 2. He broke the fourth wall. He ignored the millions of dollars of production value, ignored the celebrity hosts, and spoke directly to the soul of the nation. Folks watching at home, Sowell said, "Do not let them tell you who you are. Do not let them define your worth. Do not let them buy your freedom with a check that bounces. They are actors reading a script. You are the reality." He turned. He picked up his cane. Cut. Cut to commercial. Whoopi finally shrieked, her voice cracking, desperation clawing at her throat. "Go to black now." But Thomas Sowell was already moving. He didn't rush. He didn't look back. He walked with the upright posture of a Marine. He walked past the terrified producers, past the stunned camera crew. As he reached the heavy studio door, he paused for just a fraction of a second. He didn't turn around, but he straightened his shoulders as if shaking off the dust of the place. Then he pushed the door open and stepped out of the artificial air-conditioned nightmare of the studio and into the real world. The door swung shut behind him with a final resonant Times click asterisk. On the set, chaos erupted. Whoopi was yelling at the floor director. Joy was frantically drinking water. The audience began to murmur, a low rumble that sounded dangerously like an awakening. But Thomas Sowell was gone. The network cut to a commercial for a pharmaceutical drug. But the damage was already done. The feed had been delayed by 7 seconds, but the producers, in their shock, had failed to dump the audio. The entire exchange went out live to 4 million households. Within an hour, the clip was on Twitter. Within 3 hours, it had 10 million views. By the next morning, it was the most watched segment in the history of daytime television. It became a cultural flashpoint. People didn't just watch it, they memorized it. They quoted it in barbershops and boardrooms. They printed the words "architect" of despair on T-shirts. For millions of Americans who had felt silenced, mocked, and marginalized by the media elite, Thomas Sowell had become an avatar of their own frustration. Asterisk. The View-Times released a statement the next day claiming that Dr. Sowell's views do not reflect the values of our network and tried to frame the incident as a heated exchange. Whoopi Goldberg took 2 days off for personal reasons. When she returned, she was subdued. The fire was gone. She knew deep down that she had lost something she could never get back, her perceived moral high ground. Thomas Sowell never commented on the interview publicly. He didn't go on a victory tour. He didn't appear on cable news to gloat. He simply went back to his office at the Hoover Institution, sat down at his desk, and continued to write. But the legend of that Tuesday morning grew. It became a modern myth. A story told to remind the powerful that truth is not a consensus and dignity cannot be bought. It was the day the narrative broke. It was the day a 93-year-old man walked into the lion's den, not with a sword, but with a mirror, and forced the lions to look at themselves. And in the reflection, for the first time, they saw exactly what the rest of America had been seeing all along. The silence Thomas Sowell left behind in that studio never really went away. It remains there hanging over the table.